Yes. Okay, I'm very proud to moderate the next session with two luminaries of generative anthropology and incredibly smart and insightful people. After the roundtable on day one and the debate that we just finished, but especially yesterday, this is the second time in the conference that both Adam and Marina are sharing a session to explore central concepts of GA. And I'm really enjoying these roundtables and debates very, very, very much. I'm going to present each of our speakers in turn before each presentation. And since there's so much commonality between the topics discussion, we'll wait until both presenters have finished, unless anyone objects to that. Okay, so our first speaker is Marina Ludwigs of Stockholm University, and her topic is going to be Firstness as Fourthness, the scene as the next dimension. Marina is a docent at the English department of Stockholm University. She has published on Victorian, modernist, and contemporary literature, as well as film. Besides generative anthropology, her theoretical interests include Girardian theory, narratology, and philosophy of science. She is currently working on a project that studies the interrelationship between literary and scientific models of events and eventfulness. Please, Marina.
So I'm a little bit nervous about the technology. I hope that Ron will be there supporting me. But my idea is to go through a PowerPoint presentation, and in the middle to start showing a film clip without sound while reading, because I don't have time to stop and show this film clip. So reading while the film clip is playing, and I hope it works. Otherwise, you'll just have to get it from my description. So let me share my screen. Hope it works. Do you see my screen share?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Okay, and my title, you know, if you remember what Matti just said, it changed a little bit, so I'm not talking so much about firstness. It's still the same topic, but with a different emphasis. So the emphasis is on sequence. So sequence, deferral, and fourthness. Okay. I will argue that there is a missing piece in our theory of symbolic thinking if we see symbols as triadic relationships. We need something else in addition to triadic relationships to fully account for representation. My contention is that our thinking is not three-dimensional, but four-dimensional. The fourth dimension is that of temporality, which is unrepresentable in the conventional symbolic form, but I derive it from the temporal aspect of generative anthropology's scene of representation. A scene is not only a spatial arrangement that is differentiated between the center and periphery, it is also a performative situation that exists in time. It has its timeliness, it's now, it's too late, and not yet. Calling someone on the phone a day after a dinner party in order to answer fine to his yesterday's "how are you" would be odd and inappropriate, or to use the technical term infelicitous. If the scene is fundamentally temporal, we need to account for this. But perhaps temporality is just an illusory effect of conventional triadic thinking, and the scenic phenomena do not need a special dimension to describe them. According to Charles Sanders Peirce, all logical relationships, no matter how complex, can always be analyzed down to the fundamental triadic structure, three being the maximum number, according to him, with true tetradic form being non-existent. If so, What creates the illusion of temporality? The most reasonable candidate, I would suggest, is the notion of order, which is intuitively understood and seemingly innate to us. Sequence is a particular type of order. We all know what order is and use it unreflectively. While animal societies are ordered by natural hierarchies, with the alpha animal being given a privileged access to desired objects, human societies process order symbolically. Non-instinctual order comes into being with the production of the first non-instinctual self-conscious sign on the or the birth of firstness. The originary sign, writes Eric Gans, could not arise spontaneously in the group as a whole. It could not simply spread by contagion from one person to another. It must have been inaugurated as a result of an insight. Someone had to sign first, even though firstness did not have salience in the original event itself, says Gans. It became a major shaping force in human culture. No human initiative can take place that is not the product of the innovation of one or more individuals. Adam Katz, who introduced and theorized firstness as an anthropological category, well, I was wrong after this discussion now, brings it into correspondence with the semiotic firstness of Peirce. In Peirce, firstness is a direct pre-linguistic impression of some quality, which he connects to the idea of an icon in a semiotic sense. But an icon has to be recognized as an icon, and thus Katz brings it into the symbolic realm by suggesting that the iconic sign is simply the way firstness appears to another, and therefore oneself is other, a spectator of one's own experience. I don't like, I'm going to go back to the same slide now. I do not have time to discuss Peirce's other two phenomenological categories, those of secondness connected to the indexical sign and thirdness, which expresses the triadic qualities of the symbolic of the symbol proper. But I would like to point out that the ordinal form of these numbers is revealed retroactively. We need to grasp an ordering as a sequence before we can designate the first as first. My interest in sequence and temporality grows out of my engagement with narratology. Narrative is a temporal genre which is traditionally defined as a sequence of events. Both concepts, sequence and event, are commonsensical and innately understood, just as that of order. Which one of them contains time? Sequence or event, or both? I will postpone my discussion of eventfulness until later and will first look at sequence. Can sequence be thought of in strictly structural, that is triadic terms? According to philosopher John McTaggart, the answer is yes. He arrived at this position after having considered and rejected the commonly held view of time as a temporal flow from the past to present to future. He first proposes that the flow of time can be thought of as one of two kinds of sequence, which he calls series. The first, which he calls the A series, can be represented as positions running from the far past through the near past to the present, and then from the present to the near future and the far future. In contrast to it, B series consists of positions which run from earlier to later. In narrative terms, the A series would describe your moment-to-moment orientation in the story, embedded in the temporality of narrating, with its momentary snapshots of the present, past, and future. The B series would be applied to the plot as a whole, with events plotted chronologically. The A series privileges the present, whereas in the B series, events assume a permanent order and exist concurrently on a timeline. McTaggart then asks whether for time to be real, all events need to belong to both series. A given event is either in the present, past, or future, and it is at the same time either before, simultaneous, or later than another event. While this way of placing events in time seems intuitive, and indeed it is clear, as he says, that we never observe time except as forming both these series, he comes to the conclusion that time, this is wrong and time must be illusory. His reasoning is as follows. The fundamental characteristic of time is change, and time can only exist if change exists. But the B series does not admit change. Its order is permanent. Once an event is earlier than another event and later than a third event, it will remain so. As for the A series, it would itself trigger a contradiction because each event on the timeline would at different points be in the future, present, or past. Yet, past, present, and future are incompatible determinations, he says. At the same time, all three must be true and predictable of each event, which is impossible. Thus, McTaggart concludes that time cannot be real, but something must be real since we claim to experience the passage of time. He offers another non-temporal type of series he calls the C series, which is a simple ordering. The main difference between it and the temporal series is that A series, which is not temporal, has no direction in its own of its that A series has no direction of its own that's not temporal, though it has an order. And while time is not real, and neither A nor B series really exists, the idea of the C series is philosophically sound and contains no contradictions. The C series really exists. Moreover, it is possible that whenever we think we perceive a time sequence, we in fact observe the non-temporal C series. But if we cannot interpret order in temporal terms, what other meaning can we imbue it with? McTaggart at different times offers two instantiations of so to speak, a cumulative model. Namely, he asks if the underlying reality is eternal and timeless, and time is an illusion, what creates this illusion? To what aspect of reality does it correspond? Or in other words, if time is change, what changes as we move from an earlier to a later state on an imaginary timeline such that makes us think that time is real? His answer is that what is real is progression or the accrual of knowledge. The timeline series corresponds to how we represent progression to ourselves. At each moment, the representation of reality is inadequate, but with each next state in the C series, it becomes more adequate. What we call the progression of time is in fact the progression of knowledge or the progression of the adequacy of representation, which continues until it reaches some hypothetical last stage, the perspective of timeless eternity. On this view, the last stage, the perspective of eternity, should not be thought of in temporal categories. We are not to equate it with the idea of the ultimate future. It is outside of time, and the progression represented through the C series is correspondingly not a temporal, but rather a cognitive progression, which asymptotically approaches the state of perfect adequacy, clarity, and knowledge. Later, McTaggart rejects the idea of progression of knowledge as too psychological and replaces it with a more philosophical idea of progression, that of inclusion. This means any two positions in the C series are related to each other as included in versus inclusive of. The state of inclusiveness increases as we proceed in the direction analogous to later in the B series, such that the ultimate perspective of all inclusiveness corresponds to the position of God as the absolute being or the eternity of some asymptotic future point seen through a temporal lens. Without stating a preference of one model over the other, I would like to borrow from both of them the ideas of progression, expansion, accumulation, or an asymptotic striving for perfection as one of the defining features of a particular type of sequence. This thinking is certainly opposite to narrative processing, since stories unfold progressively, gradually revealing their overall pattern and meaning. The reader's understanding of a narrative becomes fuller and more accurate as he or she is supplied with more bits of information until the narrative reaches its conclusion. The final point is all-inclusive in relation to the available knowledge, and it also allows the reader to make a definitive judgment about the story's meaning. I'm simplifying, of course. This is it's a very simplistic picture of interpretation. It is not surprising that narrative theorists recognize that narratives are structured teleologically, with the writers knowing the outcome and thus designing the ending to be, in Gerard Prince's words, the magnetizing force that draws the story's events to the conclusion. Uh, but while I agree with McTaggart's model of accumulation, which does not need temporality, because every position in the C series can be expressed triadically, for example, through the previous position and the factor of expansion. I think that sequence cannot be reduced to this. Understanding sequence involves another genuinely temporal description, as I hope to make a case for by discussing an experimental film. To lead into this, I will once again quote McTaggart's claim that a series which is not temporal has no direction of its own, though it has an order. How would we then distinguish between directionality and order? I suggest that one way of doing so is by looking at a film where directionality is disturbed. Happy End, a Czech classic from 1967, which runs backwards. The film tells the story of Bedřich, a butcher who, in a fit of jealousy, murders his wife and her lover. When he tries to escape with her dismembered body in a suitcase, he is apprehended, tried, and executed. Correspondingly, the film starts with the main character's severed head jumping on top of his shoulders and attaching itself, and ends with his fading into his childhood and infancy. And I'm going to now to risk do new share, I guess, and see if this works and start running. Do you see this screen? Do you see it? No,
Yes,
no.
we see it. Yes, yes, yes.
I'm just gonna let it run as I continue reading. This is after, right before he kills her, after he puts her together in the other direction. Uh, Happy End is funny both on the conceptual level and on the level of physical comedy. It is narrated by the naive narrator who thinks forward and thus tragicomically misunderstands everything. He believes that he, godlike, has created a woman out of her parts. He believes that cows that he butchers come alive under his hands, that he drowns his wife's lover in revenge, when instead he saves him from drowning at an earlier point in true chronology, and that he throws his unfaithful wife into fire instead of saving her from a burning building, which he does. But I would like to focus on how the viewer perceives backward movement. By using the humor of reversal, Happy End makes explicit the place of sequential thinking in the projectional way we process information through movement. And by the way, I'm not making it up. There is actually, there are studies about embodied cognition and embodied projection. So it is, yeah. It's precisely because some movements are ambiguous in their directionality that we become immediately aware of those that are clearly one directional and irreversible. It takes almost no time to figure out that the sprawled body on the pavement that lifts off the ground and flies into a window was in fact pushed out in the correct sequence. We have an embodied knowledge of the sequence of movements that need to be performed in transferring momentum to a heavy object so that it will fly projectile-like, break a brittle barrier such as glass, and subsequently fall toward the ground. Kinesthetically, our bodies at each moment of movement are in a state of imbalance, mobilized to project themselves into the next phase of movement. It seems that our understanding of sequence is imprinted on the most fundamental, most deeply rooted level in our embodied cognition, our very sense of motility, which we interpret as progression. movement as progression and progression as movement have a felt momentum. As we follow a momentum through to completion, we become consciously aware of the sequence of necessary steps. But what do we do with movements that are semi-symmetrical, such as multi-directional movements of arms while advancing and backing during a fight? Movements that look oddly wrong, but are not immediately identifiable as reversed. The scenes where characters are eating or undressing cause momentary confusion because sometimes people do take food out of their mouths or kiss while putting their clothes on. My claim is that if not for this experience of disorientation when we try to decode backward movement, the embodied nature of cognition that participates in the imposing order and meaning might have escaped us. Instead, it is this confusion that makes us conscious of it. Apparently, sequence is not just a cognitive, but a phenomenological category requiring that we live through it moment by moment, position by position, muscle contraction by muscle contraction, micro movement by macro movement, in order to identify it as a sequence on a visceral level. What the reversed order in the film makes palpable in the way narrative sequence is constructed by the succession of is the way narrative sequence is constructed by the succession of lived present moments, with each being a protracted experience, something we inhabit and dwell in, and each connected to its neighbors through pretension and retention. This succession cannot be collapsed or flattened or abstracted as a concept without being losing something essential to what it means to be symbolic thinkers, which I claim has both a representational and phenomenological side. Okay, I'm just gonna move to my last part, which is shorter. I'm gonna stop share and go back to, no, that didn't work. I want to go back to share screen, go back to my presentation and go to my last slide. Do you see my presentation? Okay, here's my last slide, the last part. Can you see it? Yes? Yeah, okay. And finally, I'm connecting this to generative anthropology via the originary category of deferral, which is both cognitive and scenic, and can be thought of as the seed out of which sequence unfolds. Firstly, deferral is recursive. It allows for multiple levels of deferring, meaning one can defer while executing a previous deferral and defer further still within the current deferral and so on, and then go back and finish off the previous acts of deferral that got interrupted. Insofar as these jumping off places can be accumulated in our memory as a kind of orderly cue, we could say that deferral is a minimal structure that allows a cumulative order in the form of McTaggart's C series to emerge. Secondly, deferral underlies the felt experience of the moment of right now, which occurs on the scene of representation, the felt hesitation. As Eric Gans writes, language and culture emerge not simply as products of our superior intelligence, but with the explicit function of momentarily preventing or deferring an outbreak of violence. Originary deferral is the felt momentum of hesitation that follows the abortion of the gesture of appropriation. It is what underlies the performative aspect of language, the feeling that communication is happening now in real time and cannot be postponed. This experience, I claim, is fueled by the tension within the sacred difference between a significant object and the rest of the universe. Tension as a phenomenon cannot be mapped into triadic space. It belongs to the metaphoric language of energy, forces, and fields, which are indicative of the temporal aspect of the sign. We cannot embrace this fourthness with our three-dimensional thinking. We can accommodate it as a paradox created by the oscillation between the vertical and horizontal dimension of the sign. We can also access it as a lived experience, an embodied moment of suspension and mobilization to launch us into the next sequential phase of movement. The temporality of the furrow is reducible to spatial representation because we experience it as the sequence of these movements of now unfolding in time. Now, then now, then now, and so on. I locate the intuition of eventfulness in this double conceptual versus phenomenological, or cognitive versus performative nature of the furrow. The first one is event as a position in a series, or as Gant says, as a singularity, in the sense that every occurrence on the human scene is in distinction from the comings and goings of the animal world, is a unique event, a singularity that has its place in the series of singularities we call history. The second meaning of event is the experienced moment of the prolongation of the sign towards a signifying closure, and underneath it of appropriating an appetitive object. As a cognitive phenomenon, an event is always in the past, but as a performative phenomenon on the scene, it is something that is to come. Another way of saying it is that an event instantiates a paradoxical situation whereby these two sentiments, everything has already happened and everything is still possible, are both true. This is why eventfulness is so elusive, so notoriously difficult to define, but I advocate for keeping it as a core concept in GA and narrative theory. In summary, I trace originary temporality to the structure of the furrow and suggest that we would not understand performative features of language characterized by tension, prolongation, and the lived now, among others, without theorizing the sign within the paradoxical parameters of fourthness. Okay, I'm done. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, we're running a little bit behind, so I'm gonna just scoot on to the next to interview Adam. Is my mic on? We all know Adam. Adam has developed some of the central concepts of generative anthropology with Eric Gans. He has been exploring the implications of the originary hypothesis for around 20 years. He has edited the collection of essays on GA, the Originary Hypothesis, a minimal proposal for humanistic inquiry, and has written under the pen name of Dennis Bouvard, Anthropomorphics, an Originary Grammar of the Center. He currently writes a regular newsletter on Substack. And thank you, Marina, by the way. I forgot to thank you for your wonderful presentation. I was just nervous about staying on time. So please, Adam.
Okay, thank you. Okay, occasionally, those of us working in GA encounter some concept that we could say GA adjacent, and therefore a good candidate for adoption or naturalization within GA. Raoul Eshelman's performatism is probably the best example of such a concept, one that was amply acknowledged within GA, and in fact advanced by a thinker with a real interest in the originary hypothesis. Performatism was GA compatible because it privileged what we could call an ostensive gesture, one that founded a scene under no authority and followed no rule that could adjudicate the justice of the gesture, but rather guided only by a sense of some crisis, one that we could recognize as a mimetic crisis that required such a gesture, and one that could only be justified after the fact in its consequences. Another, perhaps GA-compatible concept, but one which I have not seen discussed by anyone working in GA, is metamodernism. Metamodernism, like performatism, presents itself as a resolution of the anomalies of postmodernism. In this case, metamodernism acknowledges the absurdity of any grand meta-narrative of modernity, while acknowledging the need to assert provisionally the priority of one framing narrative, at least the closest possible approximation to the current historical trajectory, despite the lack of any traditional or metaphysical guarantee. If performatism's contribution to GA would be to alert us to the narrative forms of firstness, metamodernism's contribution would be to take the constitutive hypotheticalness of GA and turn it into an open-ended mode of historical thought. I think we should always be on the lookout for such concepts that would enable revisions and expansions of GA by reminding us of perhaps under-examined premises of GA itself. And so I want to draw attention to such a concept today. This one, even more so than Eshelman's performatism, is advanced by a thinker intimately familiar with the originary hypothesis without, as far as I can tell, being designed explicitly with that in mind. Roman Katzman's Alternativeness, developed in his 2013 book, Literature, History, Choice, The Principle of Alternative History in Literature. I would like to frame my argument for seeing Roman Katzman's concept of alternativeness as an essential originary concept in terms of the problem of moral discourse in GA. As of now, it seems to me that morality in GA is understood as the negation of the inevitably egalitarian features of any ethics. But that would mean that morality is basically antisocial and at odds with normative uses of the term, determining what makes a particular person or action good or bad, right or wrong. When Eric Gans speaks of the moral model, what Eric Gans speaks of as the moral model has nothing to do with morality in this common sense, because the organization of the community against any avatar of firstness is nothing more than scapegoating, which is the very thing any advanced thinking of morality defines itself against. There's a kind of slippage in the way Gans has been speaking of the moral model in recent years, because in his use of the term in originary thinking, the moral model is defined in terms of the ritual scene, a reference that has been dropped. It's possible to make a fairly good guess as to why the reference to the ritual scene has been set aside, though. There may be a few exceptions, but it's largely true to say that no community existing today has such a ritual center organizing it. Moreover, the morality of the ritual center would be determined by the ritual conventions for communicating with that center, while morality takes on its meaning as a concept precisely in its insistence that questions of good and bad, right and wrong, be determined without reference to adherence to ritual prescriptions. We could say that what counts as moral in terms of originary thinking is the deferral of violence, but without accounting for historical differentiations, the deferral of violence will most readily be taken to mean appeasement of the most imminently violent actor on a given scene. Morality in that case would be reduced to paying ransom. Nor can the market or other forms of formal equality granted in modern society, like voting and civil rights, provide us with the moral discourse, which would, after all, have to enable us to say what counts as moral action on the market or in political participation. Without a moral discourse native to originary thinking, we are forced to rely on well-worn moral discourses that seem analogous to the originary scene and consensual enough, like Kant's categorical imperative. This makes it impossible to scrutinize such moral concepts, lest one pull the rug out from underneath one's own reasoning. But why in the world should the right thing to do in any case be that which we should wish to be a universal law? How in the world would I even know what the universal law to be extrapolated from a concrete act to be? Why can't Kant rather than Mill or Aquinas, for that matter? Katzman, first of all, presents alternativeness as a principle of literature. The purpose of literature is to represent unrealized possibilities of history. Again, this is a quote from his introduction. The necessary and sufficient condition of alternative history can be formulated as follows. Open realization of unrealized purpose of historical personality. This definition is the first step in moving from a perception of the genre of alternative history to the principle of historical alternativeness. As the next step, alternative history is defined as a rhetorical figure that develops from a symbol. The strongest motivation of alternative history lies in the realm of cultural rhetoric, and the motivation is the will to change culture in order to reform, strengthen, and invigorate it. End quote. We can already see from this opening definition that while concerned with literature in the first instance, alternativeness has far broader implications, implications we might even call scriptural. Katzman's concept of alternativeness contains, first of all, an essential ingredient of any moral discourse consistent with the originary hypothesis. It involves presenting and realizing oneself on a scene in relation to a center. Katzman draws on the observation that any description of what has happened contains intimations of what didn't, but might have happened. This fact that something happened, the fact that something happened means that some other possibility was deferred. And this means we can identify the point at which the choice that led to what happened happening, rather than what didn't happen, was made. In recovering and reconstructing that moment of choice, or bifurcation, we discover and represent the truth of the event. Katzman describes this as a moment of oscillation, and I think it is very similar to the oscillation on the originary scene that Gans has taken to define and found the aesthetic. In both cases, the event is suspended in the imagination, and the other possibilities implicit in the scene can emerge as representing the character, or as Katzman puts it, the personalities of others on the scene. The original split then between what happened and what had happened instead of then proliferates into splits at different points and levels of the event. The maintenance of alternativeness is an act of deferral in which the spectator or reader takes responsibility for eliciting and making visible who the other participants in the event might have become and who they might still become, or who we might become in retrieving these possibilities. The same split constitutes the observer or aesthetician of the scene, who represents the scene while pursuing the sequence of bifurcations back to a more originary scene. If we were to ask what a good action is in terms of alternativeness, we could say that it is the choice in any situation that maximizes the visibility of alternativeness for others on the scene, because maximizing the alternativeness of the scene maximizes the historical purposefulness of the scene and the creation of a transcendence of that scene by rooting it in its continuity with events going back to the originary one and forward to the retrieval of possibilities obscured by commitments to a particular center that suppresses more originary possibilities. We could say that alternativeness is the continued existence of the originary event in all subsequent events. Whenever we make a choice, it is a choice to discover or invent the way to reenact on a radically new terrain the choice, or what we can see as a choice, on the originary scene to found humanity. This does not mean that the deferral of violence, this means that the deferral of violence remains the moral imperative, but not in the immediate and literal sense of appeasing whoever seems most angry at the moment. Rather, it means a recreation of founding historical narrative patterns and the dramatization of the historically accumulated means of the community for deferring violence in the relation to the center we are all currently oriented towards. To put it even more radically, alternativeness means that we are still on the originary scene, which has never closed and is always in danger of never actually having happened. After all, if humanity were to be destroyed in a cataclysm caused by an inability to control our own mimetic tendencies, there would be no one to commemorate the originary event, making it the proverbial tree that fell in the forest with no one to hear it and therefore made no sound. Moral action involves ensuring that the originary event will have happened. In Katzman's sustained reading of Shai Agnon's late masterpiece, The City and All That Is Therein, he shows Agnon to be creating an alternative history of a Jewish community destroyed in the Holocaust, and one that is constructed by a series of bifurcations between alternative personal histories, alternatives between personal and communal histories, between Jewish and Gentile histories, secular and religious histories, and so on. Even the mode of choosing at any point in the story opens a bifurcation between, for example, relying upon the legal or ethical, the historical or mythical, the oral tradition or written legal code. The fundamental ethical stance of alternativeness in Katzman's reading is resistance to historical closure or determinism in the name of maximizing the freedom of choosing to become a responsible person in the midst of a historical and spiritual crisis. Even whether to write or conceal a particular history represents a bifurcation in which an ethical choice is at stake. So presumably would what to write be a choice renewed at each moment. Each choice is the creation of a cultural continuity through a return to the original bifurcation that led to the crisis, which also means there might always be another narrative level or bifurcation to be discovered and revealed as an act of recovery. Katzman argues that for Agnon, it is rabbinical history that is true history, since this is the true center where continuity is maintained. But this also means that an even truer history would be that of a particular transmission of knowledge on a personal level, a unique pedagogical relationship between an individual rabbi and his student, a personal relationship which might, in turn, have been instigated by a contingent event resulting from yet another decision, meaning that this single encounter turns out to be the genuine meaning of that other event, following another sequence of choices, which is therefore transformed into an alternative history. Ultimately, and here I'm going to quote from what I think is the conclusion of Katzman's book, alternative history is thus seen to be a spiritual, mystical practice of purification, reparation of the soul, a practice that is quite closely related to cultural initiation and to ethical historical education. With its help, man not only learns history, but also learns to take historical responsibility for his own actions. In originary terms, alternativeness would mean finding oneself always at a bifurcation in a historical crisis, with the choice being one of whether to end the originary event or sustain its openness. This doesn't mean pretending that one is on the originary scene, but rather affirming the entire series of choices that have made the event remain open until the moment of one's own choice. And there must be a series of such choices, or one would not be confronted with a choice. Katzman does not address the Girardian problem of mimetic crisis in his analysis, at least this analysis, but he does address the recovery of the center. And that is what the series of choices, one after another, must have done. While Katzman's argument is aimed not only against deterministic theories of history, but also against what he sees as a postmodern relativism, it seems to me that Jean-Francois Lyotard's notion of the differend is helpful here. In terms of the differend, the moral choice is not to eliminate any player from the game. The implication of this, I think, is that even in the most extreme situation, like a war for survival, when one might have to literally eliminate the other from the scene, the position of the other, the claim of the other, should be represented and preserved in such a way that others might be able to come after the event and issue a judgment. This would mean prosecuting even such a conflict in the spirit of alternativeness by acting at each step along the way so as to leave open and create the possibility of a shared center with this enemy. Since the originary sign was created in the midst of just such an absolute enmity, one's own struggle could only be made intelligible through a narration of events that shapes the battlefield in such a way that it could be converted into a sign that would commemorate the limited center of both sides in the form of a new center shared by both. This would involve taking one's own side and foregrounding all the civilizational equipage that makes one side possible, law, inherited forms of solidarity, technological knowledge, etc., while recognizing that the existence of the conflict means that that equipage would have to be renewed in such a way as to convert both sides into a new mode of existence. Preserving civilizational achievements through alternativeness, a maximal choice that retrieves a history of suppressed maximal choices, provides us with a morality worthy of the originary hypothesis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam. What I was supposed to tell you before Adam spoke was that this presentation is the Alternativeness Alternativeness in the Originary event. I'm sorry for flubbing that. Roman, when this session finishes at 10 minutes after the next hour, or a rough idea?
It's okay, we can keep talking. The next session is within 20 minutes, but it's okay.
Okay.
Well, a little
Okay,
late, but it's okay.
All right. So please raise your hand conspicuously if you have a question or a comment to either of these. Yes, Roman.
Because I'd like to thank Adam for this brilliant presentation. I'm always been influenced by the GA ideas, by these very Gans and Adam and other guys here. But it's amazing to see how some of my ideas returning back to the mother field of GA. That was great. Thank you, Adam.
Yeah, I was glad to do it, and you know, I hope I did justice to it. I really, you know, there are these books that come out, and, you know, Ian's book is one I mentioned before, but this book of Romans, I really would encourage everyone to read. And in an earlier book, Roman has a kind of critique of the Originary hypothesis, a kind of friendly critique, which is also very interesting. And your book on I think what it's called, Mythopoesis, or the mythology, the one from I think 2005. But this book, I mean, obviously one could tell that it's there, and it's there all along, and it's completely consistent with you know, with Originary thinking. So yeah, I mean, everyone should be reading this book. We started to do this thing where we were talking about books a while back, and this is definitely one that would be, you know, that would be worth taking up.
Adam, could you put in the chat the titles of Dennis's book that you reference and of Roman's book?
Yeah. Okay. Roman, what's the title of your book?
Literature history choice.
Okay, literature.
It's very simple.
And choice, is that it?
Sorry.
Okay, the principle of alternativeness, and okay, there's Ian's. Good, thank you.
Yeah, there is a subtitle, but it's okay also for
Right, yeah. The principle of alternativeness in
yeah,
literature.
something like that.
Something like that. Right.
Thank you, both of you. Okay, thank you. More questions or comments? John?
I don't know, Adam, if you're familiar with the What If books. These are, I think they're called counterfactual histories, where historians, you know, change a major event so that the outcome was different than what happened, and then go on to write about what would have happened. I think they're very unpopular with professional historians, even though some of them write them, but they're popular with ordinary readers because I see them in, you know, free book piles they've passed around. I don't know, what would you say about,
Well,
you know, the desire for that kind of reading?
Well, you know, Roman talks about those kinds of books in early on in his own book, and he kind of acknowledges them, but I'm pretty sure he wants to distinguish the kind of thing he's talking about from just kind of playing out an alternative history. He really wants to get at these points of bifurcation and oscillation where some kind of, let's say, existential, some kind of fundamental choice is being kind of recovered and reenacted for the community. So yeah, it's kind of a bit different than yeah, you know, what if the Nazis had won World War II type of thing. Although that question might start off the kind of, you know, the kind of thing that Roman's talking about, but Roman is really talking about something, you know, significantly different than that.
Mm-hmm.
John, this is the starting point. This genre of alternative history or contrafactual history is the starting point for this research, and then I'm trying to turn the genre of alternative history into the methodological and theoretical principle of historical alternativeness, so that it would work for different aims of research, and especially for eliminating the radical points of determinism and relativism in later research. So an examination of a certain kind of books. This book of Shmuel Yosef Agnon that Adam talked about is never, in no sense, is not is an alternative history, yeah? But it can be viewed as alternative history with the aim of this instrument, right?
But every book could be viewed as an alternative history, right? I mean, everything's an interpretation. So
Yeah, I think that is the
what's
implication.
he really
Yeah.
doing in that book?
What, I'm sorry?
So the book by Agnon, I don't know if you want to say a bit more about it, but
Well, Roman, you should if you want to. I mean,
I'm not sure I heard the question. What was the question? Sorry.
well, you know, you were saying it's not, his book isn't really an alternative history, but it is at some level. So I was just kind of curious on how it is and how it isn't.
Okay, we had this for another conference and another presentation. But anyway, this principle is about returning to the source. The principle of the source, of the beginning, of the origin, is what guided me through this research. And the beginning of this thought was in the originary thinking of Gans. So this is the point here. And alternative principle, alternative history is all about returning to the origin, to the beginning, to the event itself, and the choice that was made at the point of the event, or the beginning, or the source. All right.
I believe Peter has a question in the
Yes.
queue.
Adam, I wanted to ask you maybe about the role of the imagination, because it's always kind of struck me that one of the things that distinguishes human from animals is that we can look at a scene or participate in a scene, and we can imagine that things could be different. And I think that's really kind of important. Like Satan in Paradise Lost, he sees the elevation of the sun and he thinks, in effect, well, that could be me. Why is it the sun that's being elevated and not me? And that might apply to Firstness too, with kind of in effect, the envy of the Jews' Firstness. So that just kind of brings up the role of the imagination. I wonder if that plays into your argument at all.
well, I think, something like the imagination is implicit in the furrow, right? I mean, if the very fact that you're distinguishing, you're preventing something from happening, right? The thing that you're preventing from happening must be some way representable to you if you're preventing it from happening, right? So yes, it's there. Whether we want to call that the imagination, we could. It's one way of talking about it. So that's already implicit in the sign itself, right? That there's this alternative, and I suppose we could say that the notion of an alternative already implies an imagination. No, I mean, animals in a sense don't have alternatives in that sense. They have kind of operational sequences that they play out in certain ways, right? Where humans can kind of lay out a series of possible operational sequences in front of them, and that's that's what we see on the Originary scene. And so in a sense, I wanted to frame it in terms of morality, because it seems to me that's it is actually the kind of thing I was trying to kind of push Menachem Fish to kind of take up after his talk. I think a very powerful way of thinking about morality is kind of this maximalization of the choice that you're making at any particular moment, right? At any moment you're you could be kind of refounding the community, or doing something that will collapse it, right? I mean, that's the stakes can't be any higher than that, even if obviously the one little thing that you do won't directly have that effect. I mean, ultimately, that's the frame in which you think about things. If you want to just do the right thing, right? If you want to give the most thought possible to doing the right thing, or being a good person, or any of these kind of taking a moral action, that's that it seems to me that's the way of doing it, and that and the Originary hypothesis provides us with a way of doing it. And again, it seems to me that Roman's book and the concept of alternativeness makes that very clear.
Thank you.
I can't tell if Dominic or
Sure.
Richard. Dominic, is your hand up? Because I think you were before Richard, but no? Okay, Richard. Richard, please.
Sure, Dominic. I was wondering if there's a way to link what both presenters were saying here. I mean, Marina, you talked about the fourth dimension and temporality being a missing element in common understandings of narrative, and Adam pursued the Roman's idea of alternativeness as a kind of development of the aesthetic oscillation on the originary scene. But I mean, I'm wondering if there's a way to bring these two papers a bit more closely together. And so this is to both of you, but with the idea of narrative perspective, that you can't, every narrative assumes a perspective, but of course there are multiple perspectives. So just, if I were to narrate what I did this morning for my breakfast, I would be imagining two perspectives, the one from me now narrating, and the one of me, eating my breakfast. But of course, that's just a very simplistic example of how narratives are bifurcated from the very beginning between at least two, but usually more perspectives. Yeah, throw that out there.
Well, yeah, and actually the discovery of multiple perspectives was a big discovery in narratology that came, out of all places, feminist theory, because the original classical narratology focused on, the plot and the characters, and forgot that narrative is communication. And, and then there was a gradual dawning of the idea that the force of narrative comes from how it manipulates perspectives, who is reading, how we constantly switch between different reading positions. In more recent years, in the rhetorical approach to theory, it was, theorized how, the readers could occupy, the authorial position, the narrative position, the, position of, not the author, of the narrator, of the author, it's, could we compare it to alternativeness? I haven't thought of it, but, it's a constant oscillation. So maybe all oscillations are paradoxical and are ultimately of the same nature. It would be interesting to contemplate. But yes, that when we read a narrative or listen to a narrative, it's the least of it is consuming, well, maybe not the least of it, I mean, we are in suspense, but it's this extremely active work of our, and it's probably also connected to the question of maybe the same, mechanism, I say mechanism advisedly, that allows us to identify with character or not identify. The same thing is also responsible for our jumping from position to position and occupying, we're like these kings that occupy all these, possible positions, of all the people in our all the positions in our kingdom. So yeah, maybe it is connected to this also jumping from alternatives of if I had not taken this choice, this would have happened, or if I answered your question.
Yeah, I'd have to read Marina's paper to say much more about it, but I do think that you could speak about alternativeness as a way of grounding temporality as well. That this kind of suspension of a sort of present where things can go one way or the other, and kind of it kind of creates a before and after, right? In this moment between the before and after, and so there's a kind of temporality that's implicit in that as well.
Ian.
Just briefly, I picked up partly about what Adam just said too about wanting to read it. I would like to urge both of these speakers to consider publishing it in Anthropoetics or something, because I think these are really suggestive talks, both of them, but I'm finding it's hard for me at any rate to take it all in and think through the implications. It would be great. Of course, this would be true for any speaker at the conference to consider submitting to Anthropoetics. The other little thing I want to just make a quick plug, when we talk about these alternative histories and that kind of thing, remember our colleague Amir Khan has written about alternative reading of Shakespeare, partly even as a kind of pedagogical approach, but also as a way to recover the experience of uncertainty in these plays and so forth, that of course that are so familiar to us. So imagining what if, Hamlet did something different in Act 2, and the whole thing, recover the presentness of the experience. That's very interesting stuff. And unfortunately, I can't quite remember the name that his dissertation, which he did with me, came out as a book under.
Shakespeare in Hindsight.
Yeah, but that wasn't it, was it?
That's the title of the book.
Oh, it was. Okay, Shakespeare in Hindsight. Okay, thanks.
Richard put that in the chat. And I believe Eric has a question. It's great to see you, Eric.
Hi, I'm sorry I got up a little late this morning. I missed a good part of Marina's talk, but I will hopefully catch up on that. But I was very much impressed with Adam's talk, and the fact is that I haven't read Roman's book. I must. And I think I could make a general statement that, I tend to work in isolation, and people have to tell me what books to read usually. And so I apologize, and I am very anxious to look at it. But I think some of these new, well, for one thing, my basic point is that I'm very impressed, and not just impressed, but there's nothing that warms my heart more than to see people making use of these ideas to develop their own, and even if they are entirely compatible with mine. But I would point out that the whole notion of, well, for one thing, my notion of morality and ethics can be simply, it's a matter of definition. What I call the moral model is a model of absolute reciprocity, and so on, and it can only really be exercised in something like a ritual context. But of course, it's also part of our, the vocabulary of moral speech, like do unto others and so on. I mean, which you find also in Confucius. I mean, the idea, in other words, that everything, that morality is reciprocity, and that you put yourself in the other's place. But this is much richer as a possibility. And as opposed to the kind of stiffness of the moral model, notion of a kind of abstract model that you talk about alternativeness, you're giving, I have used the term, I don't want to say that I've already anticipated all this, but I have used the term of adding to, of increasing the number of degrees of freedom in the system. And that ultimately, I think, I wasn't thinking about it in terms of specific situation of alternative choices, but just the idea that you act so as to increase the number of degrees of freedom in the system. That doesn't tell you what to do in a given situation, but it's a kind of a general rule. But as I say, I don't think I should be, expressing some kind of ideas that I just thought of a minute ago. Rather, my point is to praise both of these speakers. This is really a sign of the value of GA, that it allows other people than I to come up with new ideas that advance the system. And, not too many people have done that, but definitely I will get hold of Roman's book and some of the people that Marina mentioned, who, and try to educate myself a little for this next generation of GA. So thank you very much to both of these speakers.
Thanks.
Roman, is that an appropriate place to end, or
Yeah.
is it?
So
Okay.
we're in the situation that we, all right, let's take another 5 minutes for a break.
And
Right.
applause for our wonderful speakers and for Roman too.
Thank you.
When we